do you have to go through a process in your growth as like a contemporary recording artist using technology and operating relatively independently, where you do need to basically get pretty immersed in the whole technical thing and like get really absorbed and kind of go down all the rabbit holes, possibly to the detriment of the higher creative purpose? But is it like just a necessary lesson to learn?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Because I think as long as you're using a tool creatively, that's more important than using it proficiently. I think always, like but I do think it's important to be able to do that with everything. Like if you have a thumb piano, you should be able to make a cool song out of it. And if you have a Prophet, make a cool song out of that. But I think a lot of creativity can be lost in proficiency. For instance, that first cellist in my band, he was straight up a genius, but it would never come out because he was just locked in process. Like he would spend hours building FM synthesizers from scratch on his computer, and he would send me this hour-long waveform of the coolest sounds. And then I'm just like, great. Like, can you put those on a record or something? And it never would. It was just like, I'm still learning. It's like, you don't really need to know how to engineer to make a cool vocal sound. You just need passable gear, right? You need like gear that people will accept. But then sometimes when you use gear weird, that's cool stuff. Like I look at a guy like Gus Dapperton. Are you familiar with him?
I'm not familiar with Gus.
He's sort of like a new, like hot scenester dude, and you can tell he's not a great engineer, but he makes bizarre and fun choices, and it's like his voice sounds weird, his guitar sounds strange, and his arrangements are empty, but it's really exciting, and I think that's. But I am coming from an indie ethos. I think if you're trying to make pop music, you better record a good vocal. Like you better, you can't have any noise in that vocal. But yeah, I think you should only use the gear, or like only expand your gear once you sort of feel like you've mastered, or you're no longer inspired by a piece of gear. Like I have a question for you, which is what do you do? How do you maintain? Because I think that when you're in a state of discovery, when you don't really know how to use your gear, that's when you're at your best. So how do you then, once you have mastered pretty much all the gear, how do you then cultivate that state of discovery?
My friend, that is an excellent question, and it was a major crossroads I found myself at a while back. And that's part of why I put all of this in, which is just basically like part of why we got into making music with technology, is that feeling of exploration in your tweaking stuff, and then something happens, you're like, whoa, that's crazy, and definitely like, I do like a ton of mixing and everything. And with that, it's like you want pure control. You want to control the speakers without it thinking about what's happening technically. So you just go, boom, 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 boom. We need to do this, and you're not thinking about what frequencies. You're not thinking about. You're just doing them, and it all flows. But because you know exactly the results. So that's a bit more like you're a pianist who can improvise because you know all the scales. But then you want to be surprised, right? And you want to have. I mean, that feeling of exploration is really precious, and especially some of the earlier records I worked on in my career, the feeling of like no one in the world has ever done this before was very strong. And so that helped. I don't actually use a modular that much, but it was definitely to try and address that. And then actually I went through a massive process a number of years ago of reworking fundamentally how I worked, and especially how I programmed beats. And basically I was looking to bring that element of surprise and interactivity into, basically I wanted to set things up so that my computer could surprise me, even if it was like entirely controllable. So that became like a lot of stuff around like library organization and building sampler instruments. So I have all these systems of like I have like groups of 128 drums that are on like a single pad on Ableton, and you can just like go boom, 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 and like, oh, that sounds weird. Okay, let's run with that. And, you know, and then almost deliberately working a little bit more sloppy at certain points in time. And that, so there's been a lot of ways of doing it, but I think part of it is actually just not trying to control the situation so hard.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like one of Quincy Jones's most famous quotes, and you know, like I think he says you need to leave enough room you need to leave enough room for God to enter the room. Leave enough space for God to enter the room, which we can interpret as the soup. You need to leave room in the bowl for the soup to fill up.
Yes. I have that quote on my
right.
desk.
Yeah. And so that's like,
I'm just like, it's
true.
true.
And it is just not trying to grip so hard or have any preconceptions. So do you know what I mean? It's like
leave room.
Yeah,
Yes.
I mean, there's tracks I've done where like I had one thing in solo on a fade out, and then that turned into like a middle eight because it did this weird jump when the loop came back around. You know, like just weird random stuff like that. I think. And then otherwise, I'm sure you get this when you're collaborating with people. But that's part of why you work with collaborators, right? Because nothing is more unpredictable than another human being.
Than a human being. Yeah, they shock you. Yeah, because we want to capture lightning in a bottle.
Yeah.
Right, and that's like with electronics, that can be hard to do. But when you don't know what you're doing, and then suddenly your synth sends back something crazy, and you're just like, oh, all right, how do I recreate this and then sort of use it in a way that makes sense? That's the real challenge, is because you almost want to walk that line between being able to control the machine and then also not. Because the machine will do what you tell it to do, and that's not fun for anybody, really.
Totally.